My pleasure to introduce both our guest host today, Ele Chenier, who's been here before and is a historian and president of Academic Women, and Elle will be the host to our other guest today, Julia Smith. Julia is a research associate in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and as I said before everybody else came on the call, my temptation was to write precarious worker under Julia's name because that's exactly what she is, and so, but I did ask her permission first before I said that. So, over to you, Elle.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's great to be back. Thanks so much, Diane, for the invitation to come back to return. I am right now in Montreal, which is the territory of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian, the Haudenosaunee and Mohawk people, of whom I am descended partly. I'm also descended from French colonial settlers and from Métis people from Red River. So yeah, it's really it's great to be back talking a little bit more about radical inclusion. Julia, did you want to say just a little bit about yourself there?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Julia Smith. As you can see, I'm one of the very few people on Burnaby Mountain right now at the campus here, working from here while my daughter's at daycare, also up here. And yes, I'm a university research associate, which Diane did mention is a precarious position. So I'm in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and I lead the Gender and COVID Research Project right now, which I'll talk a bit more about. Thank you all.
Yeah, Julia and I have been gotten to know each other over her COVID research, and then a little bit of research that I did, and I'll talk a little bit more about as it goes along. But what I wanted to do is begin by talking about what radical inclusion is, since that's what I was invited here to talk about, radical inclusion in the context of COVID and the post-pandemic world. And some of you were here when I was here before talking about it, and some of you may have read our report. So radical inclusion is a concept, and you can throw up the slides now, Chris, if you like. And while I just sort of narrate this a little bit. So there was equity, diversity, and I noticed that most of you are from SFU. So you may have seen a few emails a couple of years ago about an equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative and consultation that was run at Simon Fraser University. And as part of that, there was a series of speakers who came to SFU, and one of them was Wendy Harbour, who is an American disabilities activist and scholar. And she shared these slides with us, and she talked about this idea of radical inclusion. So the idea that I'm going to talk about today and that informs the report builds on Wendy Harbour's initial ideas that she presented at her talk, which really was transformative for me. So as you can see from the slide here, so again, these are images that in her world, she sees all the time. Oh, sorry, I'm getting your mouse mixed up with my mouse. And of course I have two screens going on, which is always a mistake because there's here. Okay, now I can see my mouse. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward, right? So you have exclusion, and then segregation, and then integration, and then inclusion, right? So we can go to the next slide. So this is kind of the trajectory that we're all on and as a society, or at least we think we're on as a society. And so this is where Wendy gets to her critique. There's inclusion. And so this is what we tend to aim for is, everybody is together in the circle. But Wendy's critique is that the problem is not the people, the problem is the circle. So the circle represents the structure. And when we look at this, this image, which she says gets used a lot to sort of visually represent what we're aiming for, what she sees is a real problem, and that is that the structure remains the same. And so she developed this radical inclusion notion, where you have structural change. So the point of that image is that the shape of the structure actually changes. And in a conversation I had with her recently, you know, I talked about that I felt that actually that the structure needed to change even more than how she's done it. For example, I feel it should be porous. It needs to be porous. It shouldn't be a closed structure. And then, you know, Diane's been ruminating on this, and I think there's a lot of ideas about how we could sort of visually represent it. And we don't want to overthink it because, you know, but I do find visual tools sort of helpful to get us through the concept. Okay, you can close the slides now. So I use this concept of radical inclusion to, oh gosh, now now it's my giant head on the screen. So let me just see if I could lessen that window, make it a little better. Okay, so radical inclusion is a concept that I use to frame this equity, diversity, inclusion report that Academic Women undertook. So we consulted with female faculty. And so what is radical inclusion? So it focuses on the structure, so as opposed to the people. So one of the things that we see that a lot of EDI work does is things like providing workshops and trainings, cultural sensitivity, or now the newer concept is cultural safety. Very important and valuable stuff. I'm not diminishing the importance of that. But having been someone who's been a historian and so thinks about and teaches race, class, and gender and sexuality over time, and then the history of white settler society, I really think that what we actually need to do is focus on the structures themselves and our efforts on changing the structure. And I believe that if you change the structure, the attitudes will follow. So I think that if you focus on changing the attitudes, which is what we've been doing, it's been shown to fail. So what's the problem with the structure? And you'll see the relationship to the attitudes. The structure is based on an antiquated model of white, cisgender, male, heteronormative male experience. And it's very individualistic. And of course, the problem is that that experience, I mean, doesn't even really exist for a lot of men anymore, white men anymore. But of course, it doesn't account for the experiences of people outside of that, and experiences which are different. And those differences, of course, are valuable differences. But they're often thought of as deficits. But they're not deficits. And so that's one of the problems, right? Is that we think of difference as a deficit. And that, you know, this is the ideal and everybody wants to get to the ideal. So we're eliminating barriers so we can all get to the ideal. But actually, I think the ideal is over here. You know, how I'm living. I'm pretty happy with my life, and maybe I don't want to live by those kinds of standards. So the other problem too is the second and last thing I'll say about this is the structure is that it's based on the individual, right? So, and this is a particular, well, I was going to say it's particularly true of academia, but I don't know that it's not any true anywhere else. But the problem is there is no individual. The concept of the individual is a myth. And, you know, COVID has really exposed this, right? So all of a sudden, we're keenly aware of how much we depend on cleaning staff, how much we depend on grocery store shelf stockers and clerks. And of course, behind that, agricultural workers, many of whom live in extreme precarity and vulnerability, both economic and otherwise, right? So we literally cannot live without these other people. So this is why the sort of cult of the individual is based on this a kind of myth. It's as mythological as people who say, you know, COVID is a scam, right? And Bill Gates wants to get microchips in us. I mean, it's the same kind of cultish mythology that's just belies the way we actually live. So when I talk about structural change and radical inclusion, it's about finally recognizing how we actually live, how this society actually functions, and then setting policies, practices, processes, and so on according to that. So those are some of the ideas that have evolved or flowed out of, not flown, but flowed out of this concept of radical inclusion that Wendy Harbour first introduced to me. So Julia is going to talk a little bit about how these kinds of ideas have come up in their own, her own research. So I'll hand it over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Thanks, Al. This is all really interesting. And I have to admit that radical inclusion isn't a concept I engaged with before I heard Al starting to talk about it in previous meetings, but I think it resonates with so much of the research I'm doing. So just as a bit of background, I'm one of the leads on the Gender and COVID project, and I'll put our website into the chat right now. But this is a project that's funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research and actually the Gates Foundation. So Bill Gates and Melinda supposedly are giving us money for this. And we're doing research right now in 9 different countries, possibly expanding into a couple more. Some of this research is happening here in Canada, and that's where I'm engaging in terms of the research component of this. And as Elle said, I think what I'm hearing, so I've been doing interviews with people, I've been doing focus groups, and I think there's so many intersections with the themes that Elle has already brought up. And, you know, this idea about structural change is so, or the need for it is as been discussed, been made so apparent, right? So this idea that we cannot do our work without considering our relationships with other people. And lots of my own research focuses on the care economy. And so the care work that is essential, that is uncounted and unrecognized and ignored and exploited, but is essential to all of us working paid jobs, getting an education, socializing, doing all the things that are good for us. And I think COVID has really exposed how essential that economy is, or that realm of space, and how the majority of that work around the world and here in Canada is performed by women, how essential that is. And so I think that really kind of ties into this idea that like the individual doesn't exist. We can't have our individual gain. And if you think of like, yeah, this, you know, old idea of, you know, what success looks like in the university environment, you know, I always think of like, you know, the old white men in their tweed jackets, right? Like that's the ultimate professor, right? Sitting there and reading a book or whatever. And of course, very few of us look like that or really want to be that, but it's a nice idea. It looks relaxing, right? But that person only exists because they have somebody taking care of their children, feeding them, cooking, washing their clothes. And so COVID's really exposed how essential all of that is, which is, I think, a great opportunity to talk about changing structures. However, what we also see is a real, you know, in a crisis situation, and some of my research is also around like emergency health policy and how those policies are put into place and how institutions respond, you get, you know, what's referred to as the tyranny of the urgent, like things have to get done now, right? And that almost leads to an entrenching of these myths around the individual, entrenching of kind of command and control systems that are very patriarchal. And so we also see that happening, I think, in the response to COVID, like in the university, in the health system, you know, being like, okay, we have to decide now, this is a crisis. And so it's just so much easier to go back to the old way of doing things as opposed to innovate. And there's a resistance to innovate. Right now, I'm in the process of analyzing this focus group data that I did with women physicians. And I think it's really interesting. And I see a lot of parallels to what I found in that research with what we saw, you know, in that with the survey that we're going to talk about later with SFUCOVNET members here at SFU, in terms of, you know, a difference between care responsibilities between men and women, and the fact that the systems don't recognize that and don't account for that. And I think, you know, that's, you know, those are the types of system level changes that I think are part of radical inclusion from my limited knowledge, is the fact that our systems are, COVID has on one hand illuminated the need to change these structures and like shown like just how incredibly vulnerable they are. And like childcare is a huge, great example of that. But at the same time, it's also the emergency style response. There's also a risk of those vulnerable, inequitable, exclusive systems being entrenched. And I think that's where the tension is. So those are just some initial thoughts, but happy to talk about this more.
So thanks for that. We're actually going to start with a breakout room, and I sort of forgot about that, but now is a good time to actually do that. And the question we were going to ask was, how do you think gender and COVID intersect? But it seems to me, and I'm not sure that I'm right, but it seems to me that the majority of folks here are women, maybe? I'm not sure if I'm right. So feel free to say, what is my experience as a gendered person? And if you're a male or non-binary, you can also speak to your own gendered experience or gender observations about gender. So it can either be, how do you think, or how are you experiencing it as a person who's gendered? And naturally, I mean, we were asked to talk about gender, but I should have thought about this beforehand. We're not just gendered people, right? Like we live at a variety of different intersections. So I acknowledge that, and I invite that into the conversation as well. And certainly the report, we talk about sexual diversity, we talk about ability. Of course, that's the framework that we start off with. And we talk a lot about the experiences of racialized people and Indigenous faculty as well. So we present this to you in full recognition of that. So we want to invite that into the conversation as well. And of course, there are really huge gaps between the experiences of white women and women of color as well. So that's something that we need to acknowledge, and I want to make space for as well in this conversation. So whoever is in the back end there, if you want to get the breakout rooms going. All right. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed the conversation in my breakout room. Okay, so, and one of the things that came up in my breakout room, and I'm sure most of yours, is, we're still talking about, and I don't want to reduce women to their reproductive function and childcare. But to me, it's very helpful to talk about this because I tend to think, so I was born in 1967, and I have thought of this issue as something that got resolved in the 70s or 80s. And this is actually, and I'm a parent, but I was a single mom. And so, and poor. And so my experience was very marginal, but I kind of expected that because I was so young and whatever. So I didn't really think, I didn't have a normative experience and part of that normative family culture. I wasn't part of that. So, so I might've learned that in the 90s, but I didn't really. So I'm actually super shocked at how not just the conventions of family work, labor division is still very uneven, but how women at SFU, and this was one of the things in the study that we did that really shocked me, is that women at SFU are facing all kinds of discrimination because of getting pregnant and having children. I mean, to me, it's just stunning and it's extraordinary. And the fact that we have not adapted to the legal norm, which is that you cannot discriminate against people for becoming pregnant and having children, yet our culture continues to in so many ways, is really remarkable. So it's not surprising then. And now if you could put up the slides, Chris, of the with the bar graphs. So now I'll segue into COVID. So in my capacity as president of Academic Women, I knew immediately that the pandemic, everybody having to shelter in place was going to have an extraordinarily disproportionate effect on women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Although interestingly, this is not, I haven't done any kind of study around this, but I know a lot of people with disabilities have been talking about the benefits of COVID because they often are restricted in their, people with physical disabilities are restricted in their movement. And I just saw on Twitter, somebody posted a doctor's waiting room. And of course, you know, 1/3 of the chairs are in the room, and their tweet was like, room for a wheelchair. So what I've been hearing informally, mostly through my Twitter and social media networks, is the ways in which, you know, finally people are like, you know, they can participate. Like we're coming in from home. So the level of participation is so much higher for people with disabilities. Anyway, so I knew that right away, immediately I knew that the impact was going to be disproportionate. So this was a very informal survey, nothing scientific about it. I just put it together on SurveyMonkey and sent it out. But I did send it to a statistician at SFU who deemed that the responses were statistically significant. So I'll just talk very briefly about these and then talk about the next steps, and then Julia will pick up the conversation there. So I just asked a very short number of questions. So as you can see here from this first graph, and we all knew this was going to happen, is that everybody had to shift to online. So their workload had increased enormously. Could we go to the next slide? So again, I just want to say this is only women. I am the president of Academic Women, so that is the constituency is women. So here, work productivity, a massive, really massive decrease. And for those of you who are not tenure track faculty or tenured faculty, what we really get paid for is our research output. Teaching is what you have to do, but what you actually get paid for in terms of rewarded and so on is your research output. And the other thing to remember is that these effects stay with you your entire career. So if you don't in your next review period get a bump, you're behind. And that we all know how compound interest works. So it's the same thing with our salaries. So what's happening this year is retrenching. It's not just it's not a temporary retrenchment of inequalities. It will have effects forever unless we take measures to correct it. Okay, next slide. So this was for people who are not your typical faculty member. They're called professors of professional practice. Next slide. And yeah, so we wanted to get a sense of what is impacting people. And surprisingly, I was surprised to see just how high mental health issues were, and far outpacing childcare responsibilities, for example. And I think we've had some public conversation about it, but you know, it's never enough. And again, like much like gender, we talk about having empathy for people, but I think that doesn't even begin to touch the level of change that we need in order to address these kinds of problems. And then the last slide, I think, I don't think we actually need to see that. Yeah, that's just the age breakdown, because I wanted to get a sense of where people were, because obviously people in the 55 and over bracket are less likely to have childcare responsibilities. So we just kind of wanted to get a picture of that. Okay, you can close that slide down. So I did that just to get so basically, based on that, I knew that there was a problem, and I knew that we needed to do something. But I also knew that we needed to be able to compare women's experience to men's experience. And I say that, I want to just note that I myself am non-binary, and this is inclusive of non-binary people as well. So I went to SFUFA, and they agreed that doing a more comprehensive study along these lines would be a really useful tool. And so that should be, we're actually at the very end. It's with the graphic designer now, and it should be coming out in about a week to 10 days. So we're here to give you a little bit of a scoop. Actually, Julia is going to give you a little bit of scoop now on what the findings were of that survey.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have any slides yet because, as Elle said, all of this is still with the graphic designer and being finalized, but I can kind of talk you through it. I'm looking at my notes on the screen behind me, so if that's what I'm looking at. So I just wanted to give you some highlights. It was a very extensive survey. Some of you might have filled it out. I can't remember how many pages the final document is, but it must be like 30 or something. Like it's big. So I'm just going to I cherry picked a few stats that were interesting to me, partly because of the gender lens I bring to it. But there's a lot more there. So, and you will hopefully see that in a week or two. So one of the questions that was asked was, to what extent participants agreed that there was unrealistic work expectations of them during this COVID time? And I thought the results here were interesting because it really showed the difference between, not only between genders, that I'm gonna get to that, but also between career advancement. So assistant professors, over half of them, 54% of them, felt they were unrealistic work expectations on them. Whereas people who were full professors, it was only about 39%. So there's a real difference in terms of where people were in their career, which I think says something about academia and what is expected of people as they're trying to get tenure track or positions or tenured and so on. And then here there was a gender difference. So women were more likely to feel that there were higher unrealistic work expectations. So 43% of women felt that there were very high unrealistic work expectations of them, compared to 29% of men. So again, it's interesting to think, is that because, and I mean, we don't know this because this is just quantitative data, right? So we're getting the numbers, but is that because there are different expectations of women, or is it because they're balancing that work with other work responsibilities like unpaid care work? So we don't know all of the reasons behind those numbers, but it does suggest that there's a structural difference between the expectations put on women and men. We also asked about research hours, and as Al pointed out, this is like the key metric on how academics are judged. And here we also saw an interesting gender difference in that a higher percentage of women and non-binary people reported decreased research hours compared to men. So 45% of women and non-binary, and 50% of non-binary people felt they had decreased time for research, whereas only 30% of men did. And some of the comments, so in the survey, there was an opportunity to write comments as well. There were a number of comments to the fact that this was because men's research was supported more. So we had comments like, it's, what's the problem is who gets support for research, and it's not women. And again, we didn't quantify that, but that was definitely a key perception. We also asked about care responsibilities. And one finding I found quite interesting was that 70% of women reported losing childcare services, was only 44% of men. And, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I always find whenever I read quantitative research, it just like raises more questions to me. I always want to know more. I find it kind of unsatisfying because in this case, I'm wondering, is it because actually more women, have children than men, or is it just that the men didn't even register it, right? Like, did they not lose childcare services because that's what their partner does? I mean, I don't know, but I think that you can definitely see that there's this greater burden of childcare on women. And there was a number of comments around this as well in terms of the written responses. People saying like working from home is contingent on my child being in daycare. Of course, during the first few months of the pandemic, nobody's kids were in daycare. Working from home with my kid is impossible. And also respondents, saying things like, colleagues with no caregiving responsibilities are, bragging about their increased productivity, and it just makes me want to cry. And, I've been thinking about this just kind of as an aside about the other intersecting inequities that come into play here. So like, I think about myself, and when my daughter's daycare closed, I moved up to my parents' house in Squamish, and they took care of her, and I did research from their basement. And that's because I come from a place of privilege where I have middle-class parents who are retired and have a big house that I can move into, and I live in the same country as them. Whereas I know lots of colleagues who are newcomers to Canada or do not come, have different factors influencing them, did not have that privilege. And I think that's something that needs to be considered here too, when we're thinking about caregiving responsibilities and how we make structural change so those people who have them are not penalized. It's not just about gender, it's also about these other intersecting factors. But definitely many respondents did rank childcare as one of their top 3 stressors. And there's been a lot of research done more broadly in the Canadian population and globally around mental health and stress and anxiety. And all of it, every single study I've read shows that women are reporting much higher levels of stress and anxiety than men. And also one of the main causes of that stress and anxiety is managing unpaid care. So here in Canada, Oxfam did a survey and they found, I think, just over 70% or 7 out of 10 women, reported severe levels of anxiety, stress, sleep deprivation directly related to managing their unpaid care during COVID. One of the questions that was asked in the survey was if the university was providing any support for meeting non-related care responsibilities. And I should note that we asked both about childcare and like caring for elders or people, other dependents. And that's really important to think of too, because there's a lot of people that are in that sandwich generation where they're caring for both children and perhaps aged parents and so on. Anyways, only 7% of respondents agreed that the university was providing adequate support for meeting non-related care responsibilities that could improve productivity at home. So that's a pretty low percentage there. So those are just some of the kind of key highlights that I pulled out of the report. As I said, it's very extensive. It's really interesting. And I hope that you all have a chance to like dig into it in a week or two. Thank you. I can't, Ellie, you're muted again.
Thank you. I just wanted to let people know as well, Chris, if you could drop that link to the UBC paper, and if you don't, I sent it in an email, so thank you. So UBC just also put out a survey, and so if you're interested in this data, it's a very short, I think 16-page, all slides and bar graphs showing the exact same thing that Julia was just talking about, the differences, and this they talk about, they do have data to do an intersectional analysis, but right now this data is just based on gender. And there's just a couple things that are kind of interesting. So it's interesting to note some of the subtle differences. So the statistically significant differences, for example, for women were around, as Julia was just saying, this is also at UBC, childcare and time. But it was interesting to note that there was also a statistically significant difference between men and women as to who had computer hardware at home, which is kind of interesting. Like we can just think about how our consumer habits, what women prioritize over what men prioritize, is also a factor, right? So that would be a question, like Julia was saying, oh, you want to dig a little bit deeper, like, and that's a much deeper question. But it just goes to show how, like, it's at a cellular level, right? The ways these impacts are playing out. So interestingly, on personal safety and household conflict, there is no significant difference around gender. So both felt the same about their personal safety and the same about household conflict. So when you start teasing it apart, it's quite interesting. Okay, so I know Diane had asked us to talk about a post-pandemic future. What do we need to be doing in the next 6 to 12 months to ensure that we come out of the pandemic, we see more radical inclusion taking place? So I'm gonna say something, and I'm not being cynical, I'm being historical, and I'm also being practical and realistic. So this is not meant to be discouraging or cynical. A lot of people, I don't know about you, but a lot of people in my bubble think that the world has changed and people are going to come out of this kinder and more compassionate. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that as soon as the vaccine has taken effect, I think we're going to return to normal. And I invite you to look back at 9/11 in New York City. And remember the media that we all read, how New Yorkers changed profoundly, and it became more compassionate. And how long did it take for people to return? And I ask you this question: how many white people, since Trump lost the election, no longer feel dealing with racism is quite the pressing issue it once was? And we see that with reconciliation in Canada, you know. So I say this not to be cynical, but to be realistic, right? We need to prepare for the fact that people are going to go back to normal. Not only that, but this is an opportunity for increasing neoliberalization. I'm not even sure if that's a word, but I think that's totally what we're going to see. So I think we have to be sensible about this and be ready for that. And just and you know, if that's not what happens, hey, great, bonus. But in my mind, that's what we have to prepare for. So to give a practical answer to that, what I think we need to do is focus on, as I say, the structures. I believe that, as I said earlier, you cannot change attitudes without changing structures. You can change people's attitudes temporarily, but you don't change how they operate, the systems, right, that they follow, the practices that they have, and even the values that they've internalized or accepted, or maybe embrace and celebrate. You won't change them. And I'll tell you a story that for me just left such an impression on me. I remember watching a documentary many years ago on TV, and it was about white people and Black people in America coming together to have really hard conversations about race. And it happened, I think, over a weekend or something. I don't remember the details, but at the end of it, like, it was such a beautiful movie. You know, for me as a white person watching it, I was so moved. It was so powerful. And at the end, everybody decided, like, this was so good, we need to get together again. So they agreed they would meet like the following weekend or the following month. And the cameras were there. And it was only the Black people who showed up. And that's the reality that we have to accept. And why is it? Is it because this is what I think. It's not based on scientific research, but what I think is, it's not that generally speaking, white people don't care. I mean, those white people participated in that program. They definitely were moved. But just in terms of like, what's the most pressing issue in their life, this isn't it. And I think that's the reality, you know. And I know it in my own life. I'm queer and I'm a woman, and I haven't even though I'm a feminist and I teach, like, this is part of the pool I swim in, I haven't really paid enough attention to racism. I haven't. But if I was a person of color, I absolutely would, because it would be my life. Like, I can't ignore sexism because I experience it all the time. So I can't escape it. It's not optional for me. But when it's optional for you, it's not going to be number one on your priority list. That's just the reality. So I think we have to be very pragmatic about it. As painful as that is, we want people to care about our experience. And what I'm saying is, it's not that people don't care. I think people do care, but they don't get it, right? And it's not the top of their priority list. So I say, so the other movie that's very influential for me is Who Killed the Electric Car? And at the very end, it's a great movie. I encourage you to watch it. At the very end, or near the end at least, the guy goes through all this legislation, like seatbelts, smoking laws, all these things, like culture change. And the point he makes is, you change the laws and the culture and the values change. You know, I grew up in the pre-seatbelt days. We didn't wear seatbelts. And now I wouldn't go anywhere without putting a seatbelt on, right? And that's because of the law. And that's the point they make in this film. So I'm not saying, use a stick. Like, that law wasn't a stick, it's a fine, right? If you're not wearing your seatbelt. So that's incentive enough to say, hey, have a safety mentality. Bike helmets, right? So many things. So I really do think if you change the policies and practices, and I think that's what Joy Johnson's trying to do. That's what I see, like, my reading of where she's going with her leadership, that's where she's going. So the last thing I guess I'll say, since the most of you are from SFU, is we need to support her, because there's a lot of people who oppose this, and they will make their voices heard. You know, you're more likely to get the email from someone saying they don't like what you're doing than saying what they do like what you're doing. So if you like what you see that's happening, back those people up. Even if they seem like really strong people that don't need support, they do. Everybody needs you to reach out to them and say, what you did, that mattered to me. Thank you. Because that's the fuel that will keep you going, right? For a really long time. Julia, did you have some things you wanted to, what's your idea of what do you think needs to happen post-pandemic?
I have a lot of ideas about what I think needs to happen, but I wanted to go back to your first point and just back up your unfortunately cynical view, because some of the research I've done has been around gender and crises in general. So not just health crises, but like civil war and conflict and those sort of things. And what you often see time and time again is that during the conflict, there's often opportunities for greater gender equality or greater equality, right? So if you think of like World War II and women going out into the workforce, right? Or even in civil conflicts in different places, you know, all of a sudden you'll see women taking on leadership roles, going into economic sectors they didn't normally do, that sort of thing. But then what happens at the end of the conflict is often a return to the old norms. Like people are so desperate to get back to what was before. They crave the certainty, the normal, you know, standard that you have, like the 1950s housewife, right? And so there is really, I think there really is that like true risk that we're going to go from this moment of people being like, oh, look at how important childcare is, or, you know, how important the people who clean are to our economy and all of these sort of things. And then hopefully, you know, sooner rather than later, this pandemic will be resolved one way or another. And there's a real risk of going back, not just to like what it was before, but even worse, right? Like, and so I think that's a real risk. In terms of like, how do we avoid that, right? It's like, you know, I think you're right in terms of changing the laws, changing the structures. One conversation I actually had with my partner recently was about managing like childcare and things like this. And he was like doing that thing, you know, where he was patting himself on the back, like, well, I do lots of the great stuff, right? You know, I do, and he does. But I said, well, you know what I do that you don't do is I make every single appointment. I do all of like the organizing, right? So I do the vaccines, the dentist appointment. I even like the play dates with friends, all of that sort of work. It falls on me as the mother. And we were talking about why that was. And what we kind of set on was that when I was on parental leave, which I did for a year, I took on all that work because I wasn't doing my academic job, right? And it made sense then. But then we got into that habit. So this is when I think like things like parental leave, and not just having like the laws and the structures so men and women or, you know, different parents can take parental leave, but like having things to encourage men to take parental leave and really like pushing it. I think like those type of changes can be really powerful over time. So those are some of the things. And I think like there is probably a role for the university in promoting that sort of change. I know that's a case where we have like some of the structures have started to shift, but it needs to happen on like a cultural level as well. So those are some of the ideas I have, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to jump in. Can I jump in?
Yeah, Diane, before you jump in, let me just say one thing to wrap this up, which is that, so I've been doing a webinar very much like this one that Diane's been attending Wednesday mornings, and two people we have coming up that might help contribute to this conversation, so folks might want to know about it, is in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks today is a British, UK-based academic group called the Care Collective, and they put out a lovely little book called the Care Manifesto. And then in January, I may be talking to a scholar at UBC who's really interested in cooperatives, and she wants to use this moment to reshape the university around a cooperative model, which I think is so exciting. So those are some concrete things. Yeah, those are some concrete things we can think of doing, but it's I say get ready to do this work. Get ready now to start getting ready now, strategizing, building your network, which is amazing that you're doing this, Diane, because that's exactly the value of networks, right? So yeah, over to you, Diane.
Well, I was just going to be the glass half full kind of person in this conversation because it's my usual nature, and press us to think really concretely about, okay, what are those structures that we might be able to change? Because, yeah, I get it, and I've already seen it in things like, I wrote about this on LinkedIn the other day that journalists at the beginning of the pandemic asked questions about what are we learning. But we've reverted to who should we blame and who's accountable. And that just so disappoints me because we're still learning. We are still in a very unpredictable set of situations, right? So I see it coming and I know you're right, but I don't want to believe that we're just going to revert or get worse than we were. And so what are those concrete things that we can do? Where might we do it? And I think you've obviously said one, which was more opportunities for networking, if you will. And the number of people I've met through this network has been phenomenal. And even in our breakout, I was talking to somebody who I met and then who's helped me advance a piece of work that I'm trying to do for my teaching. So I think there's good opportunities, but where are we going to sustain these things? Because, this actually we've been doing off the side of our desk. And in fact, January or December 9th will be the last SFUCOVNET event because I have to teach in the spring.
Yeah.
I just can't do that. It's a full-time cohort course. So, and Chris is teaching with me. So my tech help is also going to be too busy. So, yeah. So what are those, what else can we do?